morning, my friends. Welcome to today's reading. I promised you fighting, and I know the fulfillment of that promise was postponed, but today you shall have some. All right, Chapter 28, The Second Dance. It was nearly dawn. The giants of Albaceron had successfully filled in the chasm so that men could walk over it. Brach had long been planning his second attack. This time he would be more cautious, making patient use of his numerical superiority. This time he would have revenge for the humiliation Alva had given him. He knew the Dachmanon had given him one chance after his first failure. Not out of mercy, there was no such thing as mercy in Dachman, but because he had been such a successful general up to that point. He had discussed the plan carefully with Chinar, the advisor the Dachmanon had provided for him. He was still angry with Chinar for his sarcastic comments. But the Dachmanon had provided him because he was wise. Chinar had provided many suggestions that proved helpful, and the attack was set. They would start with several waves of their vast infantry, one wave of Huron men, then a wave of Dachmonian men. They had made much of the fact that Alva was the son of Alsala the Butcher, to make the Hurons think of old wounds and fight the Lacinians harder. Brach had originally intended to use several Huron divisions before bringing the Dachmonian soldiers in, but Chinar had wisely reminded him that, as much as the Huron soldiers might dislike Alva Dene because of his lineage, they did not like Dachman any better. They fought for Dachman out of fear. Too big a gathering of Hurons might be dangerous when they saw Hope's power, especially if they thought Huron men were being slaughtered with no Dachmonian losses.
Foot soldiers are pawns, Chinar had said. They will fight as long as all the pawns are treated equally. What difference does it make to us whether the pawns we lose are Huron or Dachmonian?
Chinar had also warned that Alva may have more tricks up his sleeve. However, on the day before the attack, the battlefield looked open for troops to march straight at the Lacinians.
I think it's pretty unlikely that he has another chasm underneath,
Brach had said.
That one must have taken hundreds of season changes to create. But if he does, with marching cavalry, we won't lose too many men, just another annoying delay.
Chinar agreed that another chasm was unlikely, but urged caution nonetheless.
Whatever happens, he said, just don't forget that you are dealing with Alva Dene.
As it began to grow light, Brach did get a surprise. Somehow, overnight, the Lacinians had constructed a wooden wall just behind where the semicircle of the chasm had been. The wall was only the height of a man, so it could be scaled easily enough by infantrymen. It would mean a small delay and the loss of extra soldiers because the Lacinians were sure to kill many men as they tried to fight over the wall, but it would affect the overall plan very little. Alva's cunning meant that delays were to be expected. But Brach had learned his lesson about trying to end things too quickly. He was not used to having to be patient, but he was adaptable and resilient. In front of the wall, by himself, Lord Bonson sat on his horse as though he were waiting for sunrise. In fact, he was. Brock gave the command for the first division of soldiers to advance, and as they moved slowly and steadily forward, Bonson began to shout a message to them. Men of Hurin, you all know who I am. I am Lord Bonson, a son of Hurin like you. Hurins and the Lassanians have had our differences, but if you go back far enough, we have the same blood. Despite our differences, we all believe in the light. Divan the Great served the light. Lord Hurin the Strong-Arm served the light. Neither kingdom believes in darkness. Dachman is darkness. By fighting for Dachman, you do not serve Hurin. The only real way to serve Hurin is to join me in fighting with Alva Dene. The Hurin soldiers gave no reaction. They simply continued their advance. While they had no love for Dachman, Teraphon the Wise had made a pact with them. Some of the men were willing to fight for their loyalty to Teraphon and his decisions. More of them were concerned for their families. Dachman would certainly torture and murder the families of any soldier who switched his loyalty to Lassania. Thus, Bonson's words fell on deaf ears. Bonson rode Leishin forward a few paces, then turned back and jumped him over the wall. When the soldiers came within about 300 paces, the command was given to charge. They all began running toward the wall, planning to scale it or die trying. The soldiers in front knew that they would most likely die in the attempt, but their fear of the Dachmanim kept them running forward. At almost the moment the command to charge was given, the first flurry of Lassanian arrows came from behind the wall, killing most of the men in the first 3 lines. The Lassanian archers were put in 3 rows some distance behind the wall, so that while one row shot, the others reloaded their bows. Thus, a constant wave of arrows killed hundreds of men and greatly slowed the progress of Brock's army toward the wall. The bodies of fallen men also made running toward the wall much more difficult. Brock had expected archers to kill many of his soldiers. He had the men to spare and was unconcerned if his losses were a little larger than he had guessed. The first real surprise came when the soldiers were within 10 paces of the wall. The arrows did not land within 40 paces of the wall, so the men who made it that far were able to make a formation and charge it. But when they were about 10 paces away, the wall itself surged forward. Blades as long as a man were pushed out of grooves in the wood and skewed several rows of men as they ran directly into them. In fact, the wall was composed of hundreds of wooden carts placed side by side with part of a wall attached to the front. As some men pushed the carts forward on Alva's signal, others pushed the blades through the grooves. Brock's army was urged on by the captains. Rather than trying to scale the wall, the men worked to maneuver the carts so they could pass through. This took some doing because the Lassanians had put stops on the wheels after pushing them forward, and the carts were loaded with full barrels behind the wall, apparently to weigh them down. There was no shortage of water in Lassania for such purposes. By now, the first division of soldiers was getting quite thin and was joined by the second wave, this time of Dachmonian men. As they attempted to move the carts, arrows began to come down on them from above, being shot in a rainbow motion as Chad and Shinar had taught their archers to do. Finally, the carts were maneuvered sufficiently that the soldiers could file through them. They were met by the Lassanian infantry, but the resistance was not great. And the Hurin and Dachmonian soldiers began to push them back. After the trouble of moving the carts, Brock's soldiers were in a frenzy now that they were finally able to attack the enemy. The Lacinian army moved back before them, but if they had been paying more attention, they would have noticed that they were moving backward in careful defensive formation and with very few losses. When more than an entire division of soldiers had passed through the carts, Brach realized something had to be wrong. Alva's wall of carts had certainly slowed their progress and killed many men, but now the Lacinians were backing up too easily. At that moment, the archers released hundreds of flaming arrows. They had heavy iron tips that pierced the barrels on the carts. The barrels were filled with Lacinian burning oil rather than water. And on the impact of the arrows, the barrels exploded, sending a spray of flaming oil within a wide radius. Gradually, the fire from the pierced barrels caused any undamaged barrels to burst as well, and the oil seeped along the ground, creating a burning inferno 40 paces wide. Many soldiers were set ablaze while filtering between the carts to join the assault. Those who had progressed far enough to escape the flames were now trapped between the fire and the Lacinian soldiers, who now began an assault of their own. The enemies who stood their ground fell before them as the others were pushed back into the fire. The burning oil on the ground soon burned out, but the wooden carts continued to burn for some time, as every one of Brach's soldiers who had crossed over before they ignited were either slain or taken prisoner. The Lacinian archers, under Alva's orders, had taken out any men caught in the fire rather than letting them burn alive. Up above, in the Dachmonian command post, Chinar looked at Brach and raised his eyebrows. Brach shrugged. "The day is still young," he said. "He can't have an endless supply of tricks. Soon his army will simply have to stand and fight us, and then our numerical superiority will carry the day."
"I hope so, for your sake," Chinar said, "because I really do like you."
This comment angered Brach, but he let it pass for the time being. Now was the time to deal with Alva. If he could win this war, then perhaps the Dachmanam would give him enough rain to repay Chinar for his many sarcastic comments. Brach wanted to make sure he had as much of the daylight as possible for battle, so he had as many shovels as possible sent to the front to throw dirt over the burning carts. This turned out to be rather pointless because the ground was very hard, and not much more than a top layer of dust could be gained from the ground. There was no way to take down water in large quantities in so short of time, so a lot of time was spent simply waiting for the fire to burn out. Meanwhile, the smoke from the fire blocked Brach's view of what Alva's army was doing. It was midday before the fire subsided, to a point that Brach's soldiers could prepare a launch in a second attack. The fire was still smoking, blocking visibility, but Brach had ordered the men to take their formation to be ready for the moment another attack became possible. As the Dachmonian infantry took their formation for another attack, a Lacinian cavalry charge came leaping through the smoke, led by Bonson, Diaron, and Kiel. The enemy was not prepared for this charge, and were too close to the fire to have time to take a proper anti-cavalry position. After riding down many men, the cavalry turned around and rode back, leaping through the smoke once again. Brach was done waiting, and ordered his infantry to attack immediately. Some of the men suffered burns on their legs as they walked over the smoldering ashes, but the fear of the Dachmanim drove them on. The Lacinian infantry was there to meet them, led by Pensor, Tombus, and Jagrok. After many delays, Brach's army finally met the Lacinians head-on. The fighting was fierce. The Dachmonians and Hurons were spurred on by the Dachmanim, and Hope again stood on her platform, shining brightly and giving the Lacinians courage and vigor. Alva and Bonson's training paid off. Many more of Brock's soldiers fell than the Lacinians. Brock just kept sending his soldiers in, thinking that eventually the Lacinian numbers would wane. Kinar wondered if this tactic would hold, but he held silent for now. As we have seen, the entrance to the Camden Pass was a wide, funnel-shaped opening. The battle was carried out at its base, still inside the barrier mountain walls. Alva wanted to keep the enemy army back within these walls so that his army could meet them man to man. If they were pushed back far enough, Brock's army could begin to surround them. If this happened, there would be little choice but to retreat toward Grenvir as fast as possible. This, of course, was Brock's goal. Hours of fighting passed in the afternoon without the Lacinians being pushed back, but Brock waited patiently. He had a trick of his own up his sleeve when the time was right. Alva was writing, "My friend," giving orders to strengthen any area of the line that seemed to be weakening, even riding in to join the fight when this proved useful. Hope continued to stand and shine with her hands raised high. As the afternoon wore on, however, it was clear she was beginning to tire. There were 100 Dachmonim behind the opposing army. Half of them were set on driving their army forward, while the other half had their eyes on Hope, trying to counteract her power so that the Lacinian army would cringe behind the fear they wielded. Soon she had to sit on her stool for a brief rest, but she kept her hands raised. Recognizing that she could not keep this up indefinitely, Nera recruited Sally as assistants, and the two of them stood on either side of her, holding up her raised hands. Brock could see the change in Hope's posture through his looking wand, and he decided it was time to carry out the next phase of his plan. Thus far, he had only used foot soldiers, but he still had cavalry divisions waiting for the right moment. He gave the order for a cavalry charge. Seeing the Dachmonian cavalry form up, Bonson prepared his cavalry to meet them. He was confused to exactly what Brock had in mind, however, because there was a field of Dachmonian infantry between Brock's cavalry and the Lacinians. Would the Dachmonians ride down their own men? As it happened, a great horn was blown from behind enemy lines. It was a deep, ominous signal. The moment the horn was blown, all but the first few lines of Dachmonian foot soldiers ran to the right or left, depending on their position, creating a large pathway in the middle of the field where the foremost soldiers continued to engage, while the foremost soldiers continued to engage the Lacinian forces. Then the cavalry began to charge, but rather than covering a wide area, the Dachmonian riders narrowed their lines and some pulled back to file in behind the others. Thus the cavalry essentially became a battering ram of horses riding directly toward the center of the Lacinian infantry. Seeing this, Alva immediately realized that the point was not to kill as many soldiers as possible, but to break through. They were targeting Hope. Alva was at the far southern side of the battlefield, strengthening the line when he came to this realization. He immediately began to gallop toward the center, shouting orders as he went. Pincer formed the men at the center into an anti-cavalry position. The Lacinian cavalry was in formation for a charge behind the infantry line. Only Bonson's division was in the center, with Diron to the south and Kiel to the north. The Dachmonian horsemen slammed into the front line with a crash. Many rows of them were brought down before they broke through, only to be met by Bonson's charge. Again, many were stopped, but the concentrated line of horses continued to ram their way in. Leischen took a lance in the breast, and Bonson went flying over his head. He rolled over just in time to avoid being trampled. In an instant he was on his feet, sword drawn, protecting his fallen horse. The Dachmonian onslaught had been slowed down, but not stopped. Diron and Kiel's divisions converged on the center and attacked the Dachmonian cavalry from all sides, but they were not in time to stop the frontmost horses. Neither was Alva, who was galloping his horse full speed to head them off. His faithful Grey was sturdy and fearless, but he was not as fast as a typical cavalry horse. Alva had anticipated needing his horse's good qualities that day, but he had not anticipated the need for great speed. Thus, roughly 100 horses had successfully broken through the line and were bearing down directly on Hope, Nera, and Salia. Brock's plan to eliminate Lasinia's greatest defense seemed within his grasp. Seeing the horses coming, Hope did not run. Rather, she jumped off her wooden platform and drew her sword. Nera jumped down on her right with her sword drawn as well. Salia had no sword and no combat training, but she grabbed the wooden stool on which Hope had been sitting and jumped down on her left, prepared to bash anyone who came in her reach. Hope was still glowing, but more dimly due to her fatigue and sudden shock at this impending assault. However, she had the sudden burst of energy that comes with having one's life threatened. As the Dachmonian horsemen prepared to ride the three women down, they felt that something was wrong. In most of their experience, armies of men had fled before them. But here were three women practically challenging them to come forward. Defiance was in Hope's blue eyes. When the horses were within about 100 paces of them, Hope, whose glow had been growing steadily dimmer, suddenly flashed like lightning. The effect on the men and horses was rather like the effect of looking directly into a camera flash in our world. The horses began to stumble and rear as they lost their vision. The riders were also blinded, and very few of them could maintain their saddles. Alva's gaze was focused on the enemy cavalry rather than on Hope, so neither he nor his horse was blinded by the light. He was filled with wrath at the way his fiancée had been targeted, and as his horse reached the confused enemy soldiers, he leaped onto the ground. He ran into the crowd of unhorsed cavalry. His usual speed was doubled by his fury, but his usual skill was undiminished by it. Fighting with his sword and shield, he set himself to bringing down these soldiers before they could regain their sight and go after Hope. Hope wanted to join Alva in the fight, but Nera held her back, pointing to some of Diron's horsemen who were able to move away from the battle in which they were engaged and give Alva aid. The enemy horsemen never fully recovered from their blinding shock, before long, the last of them was killed. Alva looked at Hope and said, "I love you." "I love you," she replied. Alva then turned the direction of the enemy army. He looked up to Brock's command post and shouted so loud that Brock could hear him despite the roar of the battle below. "Brock! Wrong tactic!" After Bonson had fallen off Lation, he stood in front of him, sword in hand, to protect him from further harm. Rather than try to ride him down, the enemy horsemen avoided him as much as possible because they were focused on taking down Hope. As they passed by, he took a few off their horses, but his primary concern was Lation's safety and survival. Once they had passed by, he called the soldiers nearest to him. "Hope," he said. "He needs Hope. Get him to Hope." "General," a soldier replied, "Lady Hope is in the thick of the battle." "Then get him to safety until she can give him her attention." "My lord, we can't leave the battlefield for a horse," the soldier said. "You have your orders!" Bonson screamed at him. The soldier was angry, but he obeyed. He enlisted the help of several other soldiers to take Latian to a place near the wounded men to be attended by Hope if she should live long enough for her to have the opportunity to help him. Angry though the soldiers were at what seemed like an idiotic order, many horses were dying and there were many wounded men who seemed more important, they carried out their orders faithfully. They made sure the healers knew that General Bonson wanted the horse kept alive if at all possible. Then they rushed back to the battle. Immediately after giving his last order, Bonson rushed to aid Alva, but he got there right as the last of the horsemen was slain and Alva screamed, "Wrong tactic." He had been so focused on the battle up to this point that he had not even known that Salia had been recruited to help Hope. If he had, he probably would have rushed there sooner rather than protecting the fallen Latian. He wondered to see her there, still holding the stool. This made him smile as he pictured her swinging it at oncoming cavalry. But then he was filled with great rage of his own at Dachmann for seeking to kill his new fiancée. Many other soldiers had been rushing to Alva's aid as well. Among them was Hendrin II, the son of Bali, and Hendrin the healer. Alva looked at Bonson, the two nodded at one another, and then turned and rushed on foot toward the battle. They went straight in the direction where, if it were possible to reach it, Brock's command post was. Pensor had been knocked down by the Dachmonian charge, but not seriously hurt. He knew well that the Dachmonian infantry must still be held back. So once the cavalry had broken through his line, he left them to Bonson, Dioran, and Kiel, while he rallied his men. They were all filled with new strength after the Dachmonian charge, and as the Dachmonians as the Dachmonians had done some maneuvering to let their cavalry through, their formation was somewhat disheveled. Pensor was able to push them back, and especially gained ground in the center of the battlefield, where the cavalry had left a gap into which his soldiers pushed hard before Dachmann could organize strong resistance. As Alva, Bonson, and their companions ran into the battle, the soldiers at the front became even more heartened. Alva and Bonson seemed oblivious of everything except hacking their way to Brock. When they reached the enemy, in their skill and fury, they began to cut through men like wheat scythes. Hope was still alive and shining, and Dachmann began to recede, while the Lacinians continued their onslaught. Chinar looked at Brock, but Brock smiled. "Just wait," he said. He had anticipated a scenario like this and had given orders that, should Alva himself charge, small resistance was to be offered. At first, Pensor saw to it that the entire line was held, and even began to push the Dachmonians back. But his progress in this could not keep up with the progress of Alva and Bonson. They were accompanied by 200 hardy soldiers who had joined them as they cut their way through the battlefield. Hendrin II was still with them. Brock's commandants on foot to the mouth of the pass. Alva's group seemed unstoppable, as they plowed into the enemy until all of a sudden the same great horn that had sounded the signal to attack Hope sounded once again. This time in 3 successive blasts. This was Brock's signal for the army to converge on Alva. As Alva had set his sights on Brock, Brock set his entire army on Alva. Alva had not looked back, but now realized that in his fury he had pushed in so quickly that he and his men were hedged in and surrounded. Soldiers who had been focused on attacking Pensor's infantry, besides the first few lines who were already engaged, turned to the center to crush Alva de Ney and his companions. "There, you see," Brock said to Chinar. "Danae is reckless. If I cannot snuff out the hope of all men, I will settle for Alva Danae. As it happens, the pride of the Twin Kingdoms is with him. With these two dead, the war will effectively be won."
"Just don't forget you're dealing with Alva Danae," Chinar said.
Brock smiled. "I won't," he replied. "But I won't be dealing with him for very much longer." Alva could see that he had made a mistake, but there was not time to worry about that. He needed to adapt. They weren't dead yet. This part of the battlefield was littered with rocks, trees, and small hills. Horses and infantry had to go around them. To Alva's left, about 150 paces, was a hill that reached a height of about 2 men stacked up. Alva pointed to this hill with his sword, and he and his men began fighting their way to it, against the oncoming tide of soldiers. With a hard fight, Alva and Bonson reached the hill, but most of their companions had fallen in the process. They were down to Hendren and about 23 other soldiers. Some of the enemy, seeing their plan, anticipated them by climbing the hill, but Alva and Bonson quickly cut through them. They were able to form a circle at the top of the hill, facing outwards. For just a moment, the soldiers surrounding them stopped. These men in this position might kill hundreds before they themselves were killed. The soldiers would attack rather than to face the wrath of Dachmon, but the fierceness of their trapped enemy gave them just a moment's pause before storming the hill. Alva's men were on guard, but had a moment to catch their breath. "Bonson," Alva said, "I just want you to know that, whatever happens, I love you." "I love you too, Alva," Bonson replied. "And that goes for you other men as well," Alva said again. "I love you all." "We love you too, Alva," they said in unison. "Now I'm starting to get uncomfortable," Alva said. "What do you say we kill a bunch of guys?" "Yes, please," Bonson replied. They had a brief laugh, and then the surrounding soldiers began their fresh attack. With Brock's army so focused on Alva, Pensor's infantry was able to push in. He was set on taking enough of the field to deliver Alva, and if Alva could hold on, Diaron and Kill organized several waves of cavalry charges which further aided in pushing back the line. If you're not careful, you're going to lose the field," Chinar said to Brock. "I'll lose the field for 1 day to kill Danae," Brock replied, but he did send orders to strengthen the resistance at the front. Meanwhile, Alva, Bonson, and the others were still living and fighting valiantly. With their skill, spirit, and high ground, it seemed impossible to take the small hill they were standing on, but Brock had something else up his sleeve. To tighten his noose on Alva, he released a weapon he had not yet used in battle against Lassania, the Giants of Abassaron. The Giants came down the hill as the Dachmonian army moved aside to give them room. Alva and his men were given a breather as the soldiers backed away to allow the Giants to take the hill. At this moment, however, a horn was sounded on the Lassanian side. The Lassanian Special Army, led by Prior the Mighty, had been waiting for the right moment to engage. Alva had instructed Prior to wait for his signal before engaging, but as he wanted to save his men for a time of great need. But he had also warned him of the possibility that he would not be able to signal. In this case, he must use his best judgment. Prior's men were fresh and itching to engage, and their leader recognized that now was the time. The Lassanian horn was so loud it caught the attention of the Giants, who turned to see the hardy oncomers. Both armies seemed to clear the way to allow a meeting between these two powerful groups. Glandair and his men were with Prior's special army, and so was Sverian of Aknan. Prior led his men from the front. The Abessarian captain was one of the tallest of all the giants. When he saw Prior coming, he turned to meet him, directing his men out of his way. He was 3 heads taller than Prior. News of Prior, the undefeated wrestler, had reached the giants, and they consistently said he was undefeated because he had never wrestled an Abessarian. The Abessarian captain was thought to be the mightiest of the giants. He could not resist a challenge. The whole field seemed to freeze as these men's eyes met from a distance. The great giant carried a great hammer, which he threw on the ground beside him, giving Prior a look of challenge. Prior smiled. He turned to Glandair. Glandair nodded and sheathed his sword, and Prior threw him his battle axe. Glandair caught it in his right hand. Then Prior took off his sword belt. It was amazing that a challenge like this would happen in the middle of a battlefield, but all the soldiers were too curious to move. Alva, Bonson, and the others watched from their hill. Prior and the giant ran toward one another at full speed. As they reached one another, the giant reached out to grab Prior's shoulders, but Prior ducked his head down and drove his shoulder into his lower abdomen, doubling him over and knocking the wind out of him. Then, with incredible strength, he lifted the gigantic body, turned it upside down, and drove the giant's head straight into the ground. In less than 2 seconds, the giant's neck was broken. He was dead. There was a moment of shocked silence. Then the Dochmonian horn blew again, and the giants rushed for Prior. Glandair threw the axe, which Prior caught just as the first of the giants were reaching him. He began to swing with mighty strokes, bringing down one giant after another. His special army had begun to charge at the same moment as the giants, but had more ground to cover because Prior had run faster than his great opponent. As the special army engaged the giants, they found their work easier than they expected. The giants had incredible strength, but they also moved very slowly. All Prior's men were large and strong, but they were also fast, especially compared to the giants. Glandair and Sverian brought down giant after giant, and the other men followed suit. Glandair would later say that the only intimidating thing about the Abessarian giants was their size. As the giants' numbers dwindled, the special army, still comparatively fresh, turned their attention to the enemy's main force. Pinsor also set his men to attack again, and Alva and Bonson descended their hill and made a fresh start for Brock's command post. After the attempt on Hope's life, she had walked forward behind the men to provide shelter against the power of the Dochmanim as the Lassanians fought their way across the field. She was shining brightly, and with the fresh enthusiasm of Prior's mighty victory, Lassania fought with fresh energy. Brock was losing the field. His men were falling back or falling down. Brock knew that the loss of the battle would not mean the loss of the war, but he also knew it would mean his death in a slow and excruciating way. Alva and Bonson seemed unstoppable. When they had nearly fought through the army, Brock sent his bodyguard to meet them. This consisted of 20 of his best warriors, the best warriors Dachman had to offer. They were not Dochmanim. Brock would not be able to tolerate their presence in so close of quarters for so long, but they were fierce and skilled. This gave Alva and Bonson more of a challenge, but the heat of battle was on them, and with quick maneuvers and perfect technique, they coordinated their movements to stay close enough together so that these men could not surround either one of them, while far enough apart to give one another space to move. They understood one another's movements and intentions so well that they fought as one man. Thus, the 2 heroes of Lassania took down these 20 skilled swordsmen. At this moment, Brock yelled out, "Danae!" Alva looked at him, and Brock drew his sword. It was a sword of medium length, but the blade was wide. To wield it would take incredible power, but a strike from it could cleave a man in two. Brock's thick frame was well suited to the sword. His eyes invited Alva to come and fight. While Bonson watched his flank, Alva strode toward the opposing general. Brock held up his sword in an on-guard position, and Alva dropped his shield as he took his own position. The tip of Alva's father's sword was almost touching the tip of Brock's sword. The two men nodded. Then Brock immediately attacked with a powerful stroke. Alva deflected the stroke and countered with his own attack. Brock was fast and strong, but after the initial stroke, Alva kept to the offensive. He stepped forward with every stroke as Brock stepped back. Brock blocked 9 strokes, but then on the 10th, Alva swung with an overhanded stroke. Brock blocked it, but Alva, using his own sword's momentum, pushed Brock's blade down and plunged his sword clean through Brock's breastplate and into his heart. As their eyes met, Alva gave a look of approval and said, "Not bad." Brock smiled and nodded. Then his eyes closed and he fell dead. More next time.